My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. For 47 years, I was married to a man who made sure I never forgot that I was nothing without him. Richard had a way of saying it that made it sound almost caring, as if he were protecting me from some harsh truth about myself. "Margaret, you're nothing without me," he would whisper after every argument, every moment when I showed even the slightest hint of independence. "You'd fall apart in a week if I weren't here to take care of everything." I believed him for so long that his voice became the voice in my head. When I wanted to go back to work after the children grew up, I heard Richard telling me I wasn't smart enough for the modern workplace. When I suggested we travel somewhere I'd always dreamed of seeing, I heard him explaining why I wouldn't be able to handle the planning, the logistics, the simple act of being away from the safety of our routine. 47 years of that voice, until it became as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. Richard was a successful insurance executive, and he managed every aspect of our financial life with the precision of a general commanding an army. I never saw bank statements, never knew account numbers, never even carried more than $40 in my purse, because Richard said it would just confuse me to worry about money. "That's what I'm here for, Margaret," he would say, patting my shoulder like I was a child. "You just focus on keeping the house nice and the family fed, leave the important stuff to me." Our 3 children learned early that Daddy was the one who made decisions, and Mommy was the one who executed them. When our daughter Sarah wanted to go to art school, she asked Richard, not me. When our son Michael got his first job, he celebrated with Richard, not me. When our youngest David got married, he walked down the aisle arm in arm with his father, as if Richard had been both parents all along. I was there, of course, smiling and nodding and playing my part as the grateful wife who was lucky enough to have such a capable husband to guide her through life. But here's what Richard never knew, and what I never told anyone for 47 years. My parents had been far wealthier than his, and when they died, they left me properties and investments that Richard never even knew existed. Not because I was hiding them from him, but because the lawyers had set them up in trusts and accounts that remained in my maiden name, and Richard never bothered to ask about my family's assets. He was so convinced of his superiority, so certain that I came from nothing and that he was my salvation, that he never investigated what I might have inherited. My father had been a quiet man who built a small empire through real estate investments, and my mother had been a teacher who invested every spare penny in stocks and bonds with a patience that would have impressed Wall Street. Together, they left me 2 rental properties in the city, a vacation home in Vermont that generated income as a bed and breakfast, and an investment portfolio that had been growing steadily for decades. The monthly income from these assets was more than Richard's annual salary, but it all went into accounts I rarely checked, managed by the same firm that had handled my parents' affairs for 30 years. I told myself I would tell Richard about it someday when the time was right. But the time never seemed right, and as the years passed, I realized that keeping this secret had become my only source of personal power. In a marriage where I was reminded daily that I was nothing, knowing that I could walk away tomorrow and live comfortably for the rest of my life became a small, quiet source of strength. Richard's health began declining about 3 years ago. First, it was just high blood pressure, then diabetes, then the heart problems that kept getting worse despite all the medication and doctor visits. I became his caregiver as expected, driving him to appointments, managing his medications, helping him in and out of bed when the bad days made it hard for him to move around. And during those difficult months, instead of showing any gratitude for my constant care, Richard became even more insistent about my helplessness. "Thank God you have me to take care of the important stuff, Margaret," he would say from his hospital bed, even as I was the one filling out insurance forms, talking to doctors, and managing every detail of his care. "What would you do without me? You'd be lost." It was as if my competence in caring for him was invisible to him, as if the only reality he could see was the one where I was fundamentally incapable. The morning Richard died, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief that I wasn't prepared for. Grief for the man I had loved, despite everything, and relief from 47 years of being told I was insufficient. As I sat beside his bed in the hospital, holding his hand as his breathing grew shallower, I found myself thinking about those properties in Vermont, about the investment account that had been quietly growing all these years, about the life I could live now that his voice would no longer be there to tell me I couldn't live it. The funeral arrangements fell to me, of course, because despite Richard's constant insistence that I couldn't handle important matters, I was the one who knew how to organize, how to coordinate, how to make sure everything ran smoothly. I planned everything myself, from the service to the reception, from the flowers to the catering. It was, I realized, the first major event I had organized in decades without Richard's voice telling me I was doing it wrong. Our children flew in from their respective cities, and within hours of arriving, they were already making assumptions about my future that sounded remarkably like their father. Sarah pulled me aside on the morning of the funeral and said, "Mom, I've been thinking about what's going to happen to you now. You're going to need help with everything, and David and I think it might be best if you sold the house and moved into one of those nice senior communities. You know, somewhere where they handle all the complicated stuff for you." Michael was more direct. "Mom, I'm going to need to go through Dad's finances with you after the funeral. I know he never really involved you in any of that, so you're probably going to need me to take over managing everything. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of." The way he said it made it clear that he saw himself as inheriting his father's role as my protector and decision-maker. David, our youngest, had perhaps the most patronizing approach of all. "Mom, I know this is all overwhelming for you. Jessica and I have already talked about it, and we think you should come stay with us for a while, just until you get back on your feet. We can help you figure out what to do with the house, how to handle Dad's affairs, all that complicated stuff that Dad always took care of." Standing in my kitchen on the morning of Richard's funeral, listening to my 3 adult children discuss my life as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person capable of making my own decisions, I realized that Richard's voice had become their voices. They had spent their entire lives watching their father treat me like an incompetent child, and they had learned the lesson so well that they couldn't even see me as anything else. The funeral service was beautiful, exactly as I had planned it. Richard would have been pleased with the turnout, with the flowers, with the eulogy that painted him as a devoted husband and father. I sat in the front row, wearing the black dress I had chosen myself, accepting condolences from friends and colleagues who spoke to me in the gentle, careful tones people use when they're talking to someone they consider fragile. Richard's brother James, who had always treated me like a slightly dim sister-in-law, made a point of cornering me after the service. "Margaret, I want you to know that Linda and I are here for you. I know Richard handled everything, and this must all seem impossible to you right now. If you need help going through his papers, understanding the finances, figuring out what your options are, just call us. We don't want you to struggle with stuff you don't understand." Richard's business partner, Tom, approached me with the same kind of well-meaning condescension. "Margaret, I know Richard always took care of the financial side of things, so you probably don't know much about his accounts, his insurance, his investments. Why don't you have your son call me next week and I'll walk him through everything. We'll make sure you're set up properly, that someone responsible is overseeing your finances." Even our neighbors got in on the act. Mrs. Patterson from next door squeezed my hand at the reception and said, "Oh honey, I can't imagine how you're going to manage that big house all by yourself. Have you thought about selling it and moving somewhere smaller, somewhere where you don't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep?" My sister moved to a lovely retirement community, and they take care of everything for her. By the time we got home from the reception, I felt like I was drowning in other people's assumptions about my incompetence. My children were already making plans for my future, Richard's relatives were organizing support systems I hadn't asked for, and our friends were gently suggesting ways I could simplify my life now that I no longer had a man to think for me. That evening, as my children sat around the kitchen table discussing what to do about me, I excused myself and went upstairs to Richard's study. For 47 years, this room had been off-limits to me, the sacred space where Richard handled all the important business that I was supposedly too simple to understand. I sat down at his desk, turned on his computer, and began going through his files. What I found didn't surprise me, but it did anger me. Richard's financial situation was far less impressive than he had led everyone to believe. Yes, he had been successful, but he had also been spending beyond his means for years, maintaining a lifestyle that looked prosperous but was actually funded by credit cards and home equity loans. His life insurance policy would cover the debts and leave a small amount for basic living expenses, but there was no fortune, no significant inheritance, no financial security that would support the lifestyle we had been living. I had been worried about nothing. While Richard had been protecting me from financial realities I supposedly couldn't handle, those realities were much harsher than I had imagined. If I had actually been dependent on him, if I had actually been the helpless woman he insisted I was, his death would have left me in serious financial trouble. But I wasn't dependent on him. I never had been. The next morning, I called the law firm that had managed my parents' estate for 3 decades. I hadn't spoken to them in over 2 years, but Mr. Harrison, the senior partner, remembered me immediately. "Mrs. Coleman, I'm so sorry for your loss. I saw Richard's obituary in the paper. How are you holding up?" "I'm doing better than expected, actually," I told him. "I think it's time I took a more active role in managing my assets. Could you send me a complete current statement of all my accounts and properties?" "Of course. Would you like me to go over everything with you? It's been quite a while since we've spoken, and there have been some significant changes in the portfolio's value." When the statements arrived by courier that afternoon, I sat down at the same desk where I had discovered Richard's financial troubles and reviewed my own financial situation for the first time in years. The numbers were staggering. The rental properties had appreciated enormously, the bed and breakfast in Vermont was booked solid year-round, and the investment portfolio had grown to an amount that made Richard's salary look like pocket change. I was not just financially secure, I was wealthy. I was wealthier than Richard had ever been, wealthier than any of our friends, wealthier than I had ever imagined. And I had been wealthy for years, sitting in this house being told I was nothing, while I possessed resources that would have shocked everyone who felt sorry for me. My children were still staying at the house, still making plans for my future, still discussing me as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person with my own agency. That evening at dinner, Sarah brought up the subject of the senior community again. "Mom, I've been looking at some really nice places, and I think I found one that would be perfect for you. It's not too expensive, and they have activities, meal plans, transportation services. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." Michael jumped in with his own plans. "I've been thinking about the house, Mom. The market is really good right now, and this place is way too big for you. If we sell it, the money could go toward your care, and you wouldn't have to deal with maintenance, property taxes, all that stuff that Dad always handled." David nodded in agreement. Jessica found some information about financial advisors who specialize in helping widows. You know, people who understand that you're not used to dealing with investment decisions and complicated financial stuff. They can take over everything so you don't have to worry about it. I listened to them discuss my future, my house, my finances, my life, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 47 years. I felt angry. Not sad, not overwhelmed, not grateful for their concern. Angry. "I appreciate your concern," I said quietly, "but I don't need you to manage my life for me." Sarah laughed, not unkindly, but in the way you laugh when a child says something adorable and naive. "Mom, we know you want to be independent, but you've never had to handle any of this stuff before. Dad always took care of everything. We just want to make sure you don't get in over your head." "Your mother's right to want to maintain her independence," Michael said, in the tone of someone being very patient with someone very slow. "But Mom, independence doesn't mean you have to figure everything out by yourself. That's what family is for. We can help you make good decisions." "I understand you think you're helping," I said, "but what if I told you I don't need help? What if I told you I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs?" David exchanged a look with his siblings, the kind of look that passes between adults when they're dealing with a confused elderly relative. "Mom, of course you're capable, but capable and experienced are two different things. Dad handled everything for 47 years. It's not about being capable, it's about being realistic." I went to bed that night knowing that tomorrow would be the day I told my children the truth. Not just about the money, but about the woman they had never bothered to see. I had spent 47 years being told I was nothing without a man to take care of me. I had spent 3 days listening to my own children echo that same message. It was time to show them exactly who I had always been. The next morning, I called another family meeting. My children gathered around the kitchen table with their coffee and their concerned expressions, ready for another discussion about my future and their plans to manage it for me. "Before we talk about senior communities and financial advisors," I said, "there are some things about our family situation that you don't know." Sarah smiled encouragingly. "What is it, Mom? Did you find some papers of Dad's that you need help understanding?" "No," I said, "I found some papers of your grandfather's that you might find interesting." I placed the portfolio statements on the table, along with the property deeds, the rental income reports, and the investment account summaries. For a moment, none of them understood what they were looking at. Michael picked up one of the statements and scanned it, his expression changing from patronizing patience to confusion. "Mom, what is this? This account has your maiden name on it." "That's right," I said, "it's my account, one of several." David was looking at the property deeds. "Mom, this says you own a bed and breakfast in Vermont, and these rental properties. When did Dad buy these?" "Dad didn't buy them," I said. "I inherited them from my parents 30 years ago, along with the investment accounts, the savings accounts, and several other assets that you'll find detailed in those statements." Sarah was running her finger down a column of numbers, her mouth slightly open. "Mom, this can't be right. These numbers, this says you make more from rental income alone than Michael makes at his job." "That's correct," I said, "and the investment portfolio has been growing for decades. I haven't touched it, haven't needed it, so it just kept accumulating value." The three of them sat in silence, staring at the papers, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with the helpless woman they thought they knew. Finally, Michael looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't concern or pity or patronizing patience. It was something close to awe. "Mom," he said slowly, "are you telling us that you've been wealthy this whole time?" "Yes," I said, "I've been financially independent for decades. I never needed your father to take care of me financially. I never needed anyone to take care of me financially." David was still staring at the Vermont property deed. "But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell Dad?" Because, I said, your father was so convinced that I was helpless, so invested in the idea that he was my protector and provider, that I never found a way to tell him. And as the years went on, it became easier to let him believe what he wanted to believe than to shatter his entire understanding of our marriage. Sarah was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom, do you understand what this means? You don't need to sell the house, you don't need to move to a senior community, you don't need our help with anything. That's right, I said, I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's help. I've been taking care of myself, financially speaking, for longer than you've been alive. The silence that followed was unlike any silence we had ever shared as a family. It was the silence of people realizing that everything they thought they knew about someone was wrong, not just slightly wrong, but completely, fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. Michael was the first to speak. Mom, I don't understand. If you had all this, why did you live like? Why did you let Dad treat you like? Like I was nothing without him, I finished. Because I loved him and because it was easier than fighting a battle I didn't think I could win. Your father needed to believe he was essential to my survival. Taking that away from him would have destroyed him. But it destroyed you, Sarah said quietly. No, I said, it didn't destroy me. It changed me, and maybe not for the better in some ways. But I'm still here, I'm still capable, and I'm still the woman who raised 3 children, managed a household for 47 years, and took care of a sick husband without anyone's help. David was shaking his head. But Mom, if you could have left any time, if you had your own money, your own property, why didn't you? Why did you stay with someone who made you feel worthless? It was a fair question, and one I had asked myself many times over the years. Because marriage isn't just about money, David. Because I made vows, and because despite everything, I did love your father. Because I hoped that someday he would see me differently, and because leaving would have meant admitting that 47 years of my life had been a mistake. So what happens now? Sarah asked. What are you going to do with all this? I had been thinking about that question for 3 days, and the answer had become clearer with each passing hour. I'm going to live, I said. I'm going to travel to the places I always wanted to see. I'm going to renovate this house the way I always wanted it to look. I'm going to take art classes, and maybe learn a language, and possibly buy a car that I choose instead of one that someone else thinks is appropriate for me. Michael looked stunned. You're going to keep the house. It's my house, I said. It's been my house from the day we bought it because the down payment came from my inheritance. Your father never knew that, but it's been legally mine for 4 decades. Sarah was still holding the investment statements, studying them as if they might change if she looked at them long enough. Moms, you could do anything. You could go anywhere. You could buy anything. Yes, I said, I could, and for the first time in 47 years, I'm going to. The conversation that followed was unlike any conversation we had ever had as a family. For the first time, my children were talking to me as if I were a competent adult with my own agency and my own resources. They asked questions about my plans, offered suggestions about travel and activities, and slowly began to adjust to the idea that their helpless mother was actually a wealthy, independent woman who had been taking care of herself all along. But the most important part of that conversation was when David asked, Mom, are you angry with us for assuming you couldn't handle things, for trying to manage your life for you? I thought about that for a long moment. I'm not angry, I said finally. You learned to see me the way your father saw me because that's what you observed for your entire childhood, but now you have the chance to see me differently, and I hope you will. That afternoon, I called Mr. Harrison and asked him to arrange for me to visit the Vermont property the following week. I hadn't seen it in person in over 5 years, but I had always loved it, and I thought it might be a good place to start my new life. I also called a travel agent, something I had never done in my life, and asked about tour to Italy and Greece, places I had dreamed of visiting for decades. When she asked about my budget, I told her that budget wasn't a concern, and I could hear her surprise through the phone. Most 73-year-old widows, I suppose, aren't calling to book luxury trips to Europe. That evening, as my children prepared to return to their own lives, Sarah hugged me longer than usual. Mom, she said, I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry we didn't see who you really were. Michael was more thoughtful. Mom, I keep thinking about all those years when Dad would make those comments about you not being able to handle things, and you never said anything. You just let him believe it. Sometimes, I said, love means letting people believe what they need to believe about themselves, even when it's not entirely accurate. But what about what you needed to believe about yourself? David asked. It was the most insightful question any of my children had ever asked me, and it deserved an honest answer. I think, I said, I forgot what I needed to believe about myself. But I'm going to spend the next few years remembering. After my children left, I spent the evening alone in my house for the first time since Richard died. But it wasn't the lonely, frightening experience that everyone had warned me about. It was peaceful, it was quiet, and for the first time in 47 years it was filled with possibilities instead of limitations. I walked through the rooms, seeing them not as spaces that Richard had controlled and organized, but as spaces that belonged to me, that had always belonged to me. I could redecorate them however I wanted. I could turn his study into an art studio, or a library, or simply a room where I could sit and read without anyone telling me I was wasting time. I could invite friends over without worrying about whether Richard would approve of them. I could eat dinner at 9 o'clock if I felt like it, or have ice cream for breakfast, or stay up until 3 in the morning reading a book without someone asking me why I was still awake. For 47 years, I had been told I was nothing without a man to guide me, protect me, and make decisions for me. But sitting in my house that night, surrounded by evidence of my own competence and resources, I realized that the opposite was true. I had been everything all along. I had just forgotten how to see it. The phone rang several times that evening, friends and relatives checking on me, asking how I was holding up and whether I needed anything. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Gentle concern, careful questions about my plans, subtle suggestions about support services or family assistance I might need. Mrs. Patterson called to ask if I had thought any more about selling the house. It's just so big for one person, dear, and there's so much maintenance. You don't want to be dealing with repairs and upkeep at your age. I thanked her for her concern and told her I was planning to stay put. Actually, I said, I'm thinking about doing some renovations, maybe adding a sunroom, updating the kitchen, possibly putting in a garden studio. The silence on the other end of the line was so long I thought we might have been disconnected. Finally, Mrs. Patterson said, "Oh well, that's ambitious." Richard's brother James called to follow up on his offer to help me understand the finances. "Margaret, I've been thinking about our conversation at the funeral, and Linda and I want to take you out to dinner this weekend so we can go over your situation. Bring any paperwork you're confused about, and we'll help you make sense of it all." I thanked him for the offer but declined. "Actually, James, I have a good handle on the financial situation, better than I expected actually. But I appreciate your concern." "Are you sure?" he pressed. "Richard always said you weren't really involved in that side of things. It can be overwhelming when you're dealing with it for the first time." "I'm sure," I said. "But if I need advice, I'll let you know." After I hung up, I realized that this would be my life now, constantly proving to people that I was capable of managing my own affairs, constantly surprising people who had written me off as helpless, constantly defending my right to make my own decisions. It was exhausting to think about, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, I was having to prove my competence instead of my incompetence. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. During the day, I would handle the practical business of reorganizing my life, meeting with lawyers, talking to financial advisors, making plans for property improvements and travel arrangements. In the evenings, I would field phone calls from people who were worried about me, curious about my plans, or eager to offer help I didn't need. The most difficult conversation was with Richard's business partner, Tom, who called to follow up on his offer to help me understand Richard's financial situation. When I told him I had already reviewed everything and was comfortable with my financial position, he seemed genuinely confused. "Margaret, I don't think you understand. Richard's life insurance will cover the immediate expenses, but after that, you're going to need to be very careful about spending. His pension isn't much, and without his income, you're going to have to make some serious adjustments to your lifestyle." "Tom," I said gently, "I appreciate your concern, but my financial situation is more stable than you realize." "I don't think Richard ever told you the whole picture," Tom continued. "He was supporting that lifestyle through credit and home equity. Without his income, those payments are going to be a real burden." I could have explained the whole situation to him, could have told him about the properties and investments and rental income. Instead, I simply said, "I understand your concern, but I've reviewed everything with my financial advisors, and I'm confident in my position." The silence that followed was the same silence I had heard from Mrs. Patterson, from Richard's relatives, from my own children when they first realized I wasn't the helpless woman they thought they knew. It was the silence of people trying to adjust their understanding of reality to accommodate new information that didn't fit their preconceptions. 3 months after Richard's funeral, I took my first trip to Italy. I had booked a luxury tour that included Florence, Rome, and the Amalfi Coast, places I had dreamed of seeing for 40 years. When I told people about my travel plans, the reactions were predictably mixed. Sarah was excited for me. "Mom, that sounds amazing. You deserve to do something wonderful for yourself." Michael was more cautious. "Mom, are you sure about this? It's a big expense and traveling alone at your age. Maybe you should wait and see how the finances shake out over the next year." David was worried about the practical aspects. "Mom, what if something happens to you while you're over there? What if you get sick or lost or confused about the language?" I understood their concerns, but I also understood something they didn't. I had waited 73 years to live my life on my own terms. I wasn't going to wait any longer. The trip was everything I had hoped it would be and more. I stood in the Sistine Chapel and cried, not because I was overwhelmed by the art, but because I was overwhelmed by the realization that I was finally free to experience beauty without having to justify it to anyone. I ate gelato for breakfast in Florence and stayed out until midnight in Rome, not because I was being rebellious, but because for the first time in my adult life, no one was monitoring my choices or questioning my judgment. I met other travelers, mostly women my age or younger, and when they asked about my background, I found myself telling them the truth. I was a recent widow who was finally getting to see the world on her own terms. Some of them were envious, some were inspired, but none of them seemed to think there was anything strange about a 73-year-old woman traveling solo through Europe. When I returned from Italy, I was tanned and energetic and full of stories about museums and restaurants and conversations with strangers. I had bought clothes in Florence, jewelry in Rome, and books in 3 languages that I couldn't read but wanted to learn. I realized, like a woman who was living her life instead of simply surviving it. The changes in how people responded to me were subtle but significant. Mrs. Patterson stopped suggesting that I sell the house and started asking about my renovations. Richard's relatives stopped offering to help me with finances and started asking about my travels. My children stopped treating me like a problem to be solved and started treating me like an interesting person they wanted to spend time with. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. For 47 years, I had defined myself through Richard's eyes, the helpless woman who couldn't manage without him. For 3 months after his death, I had defined myself through other people's assumptions, the vulnerable widow who needed protection and guidance. Now finally I was defining myself through my own eyes, a woman who had raised 3 children, managed a household, cared for a sick husband, and maintained her own financial independence through decades of marriage to a man who never knew she had it. A woman who could plan a trip to Italy, navigate foreign cities, and come home with stories and experiences and a confidence that no one could take away from her. 6 months after Richard's funeral, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the first time in 20 years. Not because I had always been prevented from hosting before, but because I had never felt confident enough to take on the responsibility. This year, I invited my children and their families, Richard's relatives, several neighbors, and 3 women I had met through a travel group I had joined. The dinner was a success in ways that surprised everyone, especially me. I cooked dishes I had always wanted to try, decorated the house the way I had always wanted it to look, and orchestrated an evening that felt more like a celebration than a dutiful family gathering. During dinner, David raised his glass and said, "I want to make a toast to Mom, who has surprised all of us this year with her strength, her independence, and her incredible cooking." Sarah added, "And to Dad, who would be amazed to see how well Mom has managed everything on her own." I appreciated their words, but I also understood something they still didn't quite grasp. Richard wouldn't have been amazed. He would have been confused, possibly threatened, and ultimately unable to accept evidence that contradicted his fundamental belief about my helplessness. The man who told me for 47 years that I was nothing without him would never have been able to celebrate my independence. But I could celebrate it. And after 47 years of being told I was insufficient, after 73 years of defining myself through other people's expectations, I was finally learning what it felt like to be proud of myself. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up the dishes, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been on the morning of Richard's funeral. That woman had been convinced she was nothing without her husband. She had sat quietly while her children planned her future, had accepted condolences from people who pitied her vulnerability, had believed that her life was essentially over now that her protector was gone. But that woman had been living a lie that wasn't even her own. She had been living Richard's lie, the story he needed to tell himself about their marriage in order to feel essential, important, irreplaceable. And I had loved him enough to let him believe that story, even when it meant sacrificing my own sense of self-worth. Now, 6 months later, I was washing dishes in my own house, planning another trip to Greece in the spring, considering taking art classes at the community college, and thinking about maybe getting a dog for the first time since the children were young. I was living my own story, finally, and it was a much better story than anyone had ever imagined. The phone rang as I was finishing in the kitchen. It was Sarah, calling to thank me for dinner and to tell me something she said she had been thinking about all evening. "Mom," she said, "I owe you an apology. Not just for the way we treated you after Dad died, assuming you couldn't handle things. I owe you an apology for never seeing who you really were all those years. We all just accepted Dad's version of you, and we never questioned whether it was accurate. You were children," I said, "you learned what you saw. But we weren't children after Dad's funeral," she continued. "We were adults, and we still couldn't see you clearly. It took those bank statements and property deeds to make us realize that you're a completely different person than we thought you were." "I'm the same person I always was," I said. "You just finally have permission to see it." "What do you mean?" I thought about how to explain something I was only beginning to understand myself. Your father needed me to be helpless, I said. It wasn't conscious or malicious, but his sense of himself as a provider and protector depended on me being someone who needed providing for and protecting. If I had been obviously competent and independent, it would have threatened his identity as the essential one in our marriage. But that must have been awful for you. Sometimes it was, I admitted. But I also understood that marriage requires compromises, and this felt like the price of keeping our family together. I had no way of knowing that you children would carry that same perception of me into your adult lives. Do you regret it? Sarah asked. Staying married to someone who couldn't see your strength. It was a question I had asked myself many times over the past 6 months, and the answer was complicated. I regret that I lost myself for so many years, I said. I regret that I forgot who I was capable of being, but I don't regret the marriage entirely. Your father was a good man in many ways, and we had a life together, and that life gave me you 3. But you could have had so much more. Maybe, I said. But I can still have more now. That's the advantage of discovering your own strength at 73 instead of never discovering it at all. After we hung up, I realized that Sarah's call represented something important. My children were beginning to see me not just as a financially independent person, but as a person with agency, with choices, with a complex inner life that they had never bothered to explore. It was the beginning of having real relationships with them instead of just playing the role of the mother who needed their care and management. Over the following months, these new relationships deepened in ways that surprised all of us. Michael started calling me not just to check on me, but to ask my advice about decisions he was making in his own life. David began sharing stories about his work and his marriage that he had never shared before, treating me like a trusted friend instead of a dependent relative. Sarah and I started taking weekend trips together, not because she was worried about me traveling alone, but because she enjoyed my company and wanted to share experiences with me. The most significant change, though, was in how I related to other people outside my family. For decades, I had been the quiet wife who stood slightly behind her more dominant husband at social gatherings. I had been the woman other women felt comfortable confiding in because I seemed safe, non-threatening, unlikely to judge or compete. Now I found myself becoming someone others looked to for advice and leadership. When the neighborhood book club needed someone to organize their annual fundraiser, they asked me. When the church committee was planning a major renovation project, they wanted my input. When my travel group was deciding on destinations for next year, they looked to me as someone whose judgment they trusted. It wasn't just that I had money now, although the financial security certainly gave me confidence I had never had before. It was that I had proven to myself that I could handle complex situations, make good decisions, and take care of myself in ways that went far beyond paying bills and managing property. I had navigated Italian train systems, negotiated with contractors about home renovations, researched investment opportunities, and planned social events that brought people together successfully. I had discovered that the woman Richard had dismissed as helpless was actually quite capable of figuring things out, solving problems, and taking charge when necessary. A year after Richard's death, I decided to host a memorial service for him in our backyard garden. Not because I felt obligated to, but because I wanted to create a final opportunity for people to share their memories of him, and for me to say goodbye to that chapter of my life in a way that felt meaningful. I planned the entire event myself, from the catering to the flowers to the program of speakers. It was, I realized, the first major event I had ever organized entirely according to my own vision, without having to accommodate Richard's preferences or worry about his approval. The service was beautiful, filled with stories about Richard's kindness, his work ethic, his devotion to his family. People spoke about his generosity, his sense of humor, his willingness to help friends and neighbors when they needed support. I listened to these stories and remembered why I had loved him, despite everything. But I also understood something I couldn't have understood a year earlier. Richard's good qualities didn't negate the damage his need to control had done to our marriage, and my love for him didn't mean I had to continue living as if his assessment of my capabilities was accurate. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about the 47 years we had shared, about the life we had built together, about the children we had raised, and the experiences we had accumulated. But I also said something that surprised even me. Richard believed that I needed him to take care of me, I said to the gathered friends and family, and in some ways that was true. I needed his love, his partnership, his presence in my life. But I think Richard would be amazed to discover that I was always more capable than either of us realized. This past year has taught me that love doesn't require helplessness and strength doesn't threaten love. I wish we could have learned that together. After the service, as people were lingering in the garden sharing memories and eating the food I had prepared, Richard's brother James pulled me aside. "Margaret," he said, "I owe you an apology. At Richard's funeral, I was so convinced that you would need help with everything that you couldn't possibly manage on your own. I was wrong about that. You weren't wrong to offer help, I said. You were just wrong about what kind of help I needed. What do you mean? I didn't need someone to manage my life for me, I explained. I needed permission to manage it myself. I needed people to believe I was capable of figuring things out instead of assuming I wasn't. James looked thoughtful. Linda and I have been talking about this actually. About how we automatically assumed you were helpless just because Richard always presented you that way. We never really got to know you as a person separate from him. Most people didn't, I said. I'm not sure I knew myself as a person separate from him. But you do now. I looked around the garden, at the friends and family who had come to honor Richard's memory at an event I had planned and executed entirely on my own terms. I thought about the trips I had taken, the decisions I had made, the life I was building based on my own preferences and priorities for the first time in decades. Yes, I said. I do now. 2 years after Richard's death, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I sold the bed and breakfast in Vermont and used the money to buy a small villa in Tuscany. Not as an investment property, but as a place where I could spend several months each year, learning Italian, taking cooking classes, and living the kind of life I had dreamed about but never thought I deserved. The decision shocked everyone, including my children. David was the most vocal in his concerns. Mom, this seems really impulsive. Moving to another country, even part-time at your age? What if something happens to you? What if you get sick or have an emergency or just decide you don't like it there? Then I'll come home, I said simply, or I'll figure out how to handle whatever situation arises. The same way I've been figuring things out for the past 2 years. Michael was worried about the practical aspects. Mom, do you even speak Italian? How are you going to communicate with doctors, lawyers, contractors, all the people you'll need to deal with? I'm learning Italian, I said. And I've managed to communicate with doctors and lawyers and contractors in several countries over the past 2 years. I'm more resourceful than you think. Sarah was the most direct. Mom, are you running away from something? This seems like such a dramatic change. I'm not running away, I said. I'm running toward something. I'm running toward the life I want to live for whatever years I have left. The conversation continued for hours, with my children raising practical concerns and emotional objections to my plan. But something had changed in the dynamic between us. They were no longer making decisions about my life or telling me what I should do. They were expressing their worries and asking questions, but ultimately acknowledging that this was my choice to make. When I moved to Tuscany for the first time, spending 3 months in a small town outside of Florence, I discovered something remarkable. I was good at being alone. Not just comfortable with solitude, but actually skilled at creating a life that felt full and meaningful without depending on other people for validation or companionship. I rented a small apartment above a bakery, enrolled in an Italian language class at the local community center, and signed up for cooking lessons with a woman who had been teaching traditional Tuscan cuisine to tourists for 20 years. Within a month, I had a routine, a small circle of acquaintances, and a sense of belonging in a place where no one knew my history or had any preconceptions about my capabilities. For the first time in my adult life, I was defining myself entirely through my own actions and choices, not through my relationship to a husband or my role as a mother or my position in a community that had known me for decades. I was simply Margaret, a woman from America who was learning to make proper ragu and could hold increasingly complex conversations about art and politics and daily life in Italian. The experience was so liberating that I extended my stay to 6 months, then began planning to spend half of each year in Italy. When I told my children about this decision, their reactions revealed how much our relationships had evolved. Mom, Sarah said, I think this is amazing. You seem happier and more confident than I've ever seen you. Michael was more cautious but supportive. I worry about you being so far away, but I can see that this is good for you. And you've proven that you can handle whatever comes up. David was the most enthusiastic. Mom, I'm actually jealous. You're living this incredible adventure and you're doing it at 75. It's inspiring. Their responses told me something important. They had finally begun to see me the way I was learning to see myself. Not as a woman who needed protection and management, but as a person who was capable of creating her own adventures and handling her own challenges. 3 years after Richard's funeral, I was sitting in my garden in Tuscany, reading a book in Italian while dinner cooked on the stove, when I received a phone call that brought the whole journey full circle. It was Mrs. Patterson, my former neighbor, calling to tell me that her husband had died suddenly and she was struggling with the same issues I had faced as a new widow. Margaret, she said, crying, I don't know what to do. Harold handled everything, and I don't even know where our bank accounts are or how to pay the bills. Everyone keeps telling me I should sell the house and move somewhere smaller, but I don't want to leave my home. I feel so lost and helpless. I listened to her describe her situation, and I heard myself 3 years earlier. The woman who believed she was nothing without her husband, who accepted other people's assumptions about her incompetence, who couldn't imagine a future that looked different from her past. Dorothy, I said gently, you're not helpless. You're grieving and overwhelmed, which is completely normal, but you're not helpless. But I've never handled any of the financial stuff, Margaret. Harold always said I didn't need to worry about it, that he would take care of everything. Now I don't even know where to start. You start by gathering information, I said. You find all the paperwork, you call the bank, you make a list of what you know and what you need to learn. And you take it one step at a time, without letting anyone rush you into decisions you're not ready to make. But what if I make mistakes? What if I can't figure it out? Then you'll learn from the mistakes and figure it out anyway, I said. Dorothy, you ran a household for 46 years. You raised 4 children. You organized every social event at your church for the past decade. You managed your husband's care through 2 years of illness. You're not suddenly incompetent just because Harold is gone. The conversation lasted for over an hour, and by the end, Dorothy sounded calmer and more focused. She had made a list of things to do the next day, had accepted my offer to help her organize Harold's papers when I returned from Italy, and had decided to ignore her daughter's pressure to put the house on the market immediately. After we hung up, I realized that helping Dorothy had given me a new perspective on my own journey. 3 years ago, I had been in her position, convinced that I was incapable of managing my own life. The difference was that I had discovered resources and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. Dorothy would have to discover her own strengths and resources, but the process of discovery would be the same. One step at a time, one decision at a time, one day of proving to herself that she was more capable than anyone had ever told her she was. That conversation inspired me to start something I had never considered before. A support group for women who were learning to rebuild their lives after the death of a spouse. When I returned to the United States, I contacted the community center and proposed a monthly meeting for widows who wanted to share resources, advice, and encouragement as they navigated their new independence. The first meeting drew 8 women, ranging in age from 52 to 81. Each of them had a different story, but the themes were remarkably similar. Husbands who had controlled the finances, families who assumed they would need constant help, a society that treated them as if widowhood had rendered them incapable of making their own decisions. Over the months that followed, I watched these women discover their own strength in the same way I had discovered mine. Martha, who had been married to a man who never let her drive on the highway, took a road trip to visit her grandchildren in another state. Linda, whose husband had insisted she could never understand investments, learned to manage her own portfolio and increased her returns by 15%. Carol, who had been told by her adult children that she needed to move to assisted living, renovated her kitchen instead and started hosting family dinners again. Each of these women had been told in various ways that they were nothing without their husbands. Each of them discovered that the opposite was true. They had been everything all along, just waiting for permission to recognize it. Running these meetings became one of the most rewarding parts of my new life. Not just because I was helping other women, but because each woman's journey reminded me of how far I had come from that morning, when my children sat around my kitchen table, planning my future, as if I had no agency in determining it myself. 4 years after Richard's death, I decided to write down my story. Not for publication, but for my grandchildren, so that someday they would understand that their grandmother was more than the quiet, dependent woman they remembered from their childhood. I wanted them to know that it's possible to rediscover yourself at any age, that it's never too late to start living according to your own values and priorities. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about all the women who never get the chance to discover their own strength, who live their entire lives believing they are nothing without someone else to define them and direct them. I thought about the women in my support group who were just beginning their own journeys of self-discovery, and about the countless others who might benefit from hearing these stories. That's when I decided to share my story more broadly, starting with this recording, because I think there are probably other women out there, maybe listening to this right now, who have been told they are insufficient, incapable, or helpless.